And let me make a point here that I am convinced that is true, but I can't prove it. But see if you agree with me here. This is another portrait by John Singer Sargent. It's painted decades after the first portrait that I showed you, this earlier portrait that we referred to a moment ago. Many decades have passed. Photographs like these are being produced, and I am absolutely convinced that the tables have been turned on the portrait painters. I'm convinced that the way that this portrait is lit and the in and out light, lost and found mystery of it, I am certain has actually been influenced by these type of photographs. These photographers who were in the shadow of artists like John Singer Sargent are now an inspiration for artists like John Singer Sargent. And I'll let that one rest with you. So I want you to believe that even if you're doing a 2-hour classroom study, it doesn't have to just be a classroom study. It can actually be designed and have actual composition worked into it. I have tried my very best to learn the lesson from both John Singer Sargent and the early photographers, to understand that a simple, clear value grouping is often a full statement than excessive detail and excessive subtleties. And so I've done my very best to be considerate of that principle as I've put together my 2-hour classroom studies and my personal work, which tends to take around the same amount of time. I usually spend portraits like these, I'll probably spend something like anywhere from an hour and a half to 2 hours on. And then I usually come back. I'll take a fresh look at them after the fact. Now, usually the model isn't available, so I try not to do too much, because if you rework a portrait extensively, you're likely to lose the likeness. But I do like to take a fresh look at it a couple of days later, and I may notice a few things. Maybe the backdrop can get an adjustment, maybe a few edges are out of whack, and I can do some fine tuning and subtleties. So I usually put a little extra time after the fact to fine tune those portraits, and that's where I stand on that. And those decisions tend to be made in reference to getting a good, strong, and simple value grouping. So these will be our 4 principles of composition that we can bring to all of our portrait work, even our classroom studies. We've just talked about value grouping, from the extremes of the 2 value photographers to maybe 3 or 4 value structures with some transitions in between those. So let's move from there and talk about the idea of a focal area. We tend to like to have one part of an image made to be more special or more meaningful than the rest. We're hierarchical by nature in our thinking. And so if every part of an image is made to be equally important, then by default, every part of that image is equally unimportant. Does that make sense? That's just how we are. It's just like, for instance, let's say you get married. You want that day to stand out more than just a plain, ordinary, regular day. So what do? You spend way too much money on clothes that you're only going to wear one day and hopefully never wear again. It almost seems ridiculous, and yet we do it anyway, because we want that one day to stand out as special. And that's what I mean by we're hierarchical by nature. We want certain things that we consider to be more special to stand out and in contrast to their environment. We like a focal area. Art is being human. What we like as human beings is what translates into good art. So you're doing your classroom study. Why not make a special effort to control the contrasts in your image? Isn't that what we've been talking about as we make decisions on where hard and soft edges and where contrasts exist in our image? Obviously, this area right here is meant to be the most important part of this drawing. Most anyone would agree with that. So we take and put the most visual activity in that area and let other areas be more passive and more vignetted so that this most important area stands out as special. In this image, we've looked at this one before as we've talked about rendering with some of our different materials. And I want your eye to go right to his face. I don't want you to look down at some hard, exaggerated edges and contrast down here. There would be no purpose for it. I'm bringing the value contrast up where I want the eye to be drawn to. And I'm being a little bit tricky in this image. I'm intentionally doing things to pull your eye back up to her eyes. Our eyes naturally want to go to eyes first. Of course, psychologically, we are just hardwired. Try and look. You can do it, of course, but psychologically, you feel the pull of those eyes wanting to draw you back. And so why not visually reinforce that idea to bring some strength to this image, to bring some architecture, so to speak, to design a framework that reinforces what your eyes want and need to do anyway. So see these lines right here? The shawl she was wearing didn't quite come across at that angle, so I intentionally reworked that shawl, these lines here and those lines here, to point right back up at her eyes. Strokes like these in her hair. This stroke right here is very intentional, and I'm sorry, but not apologetic that I'm being tricky and sneaky here in this image. But by gosh, I want my drawings to grab people. I want people to feel something. I want people to look at it and in some way at that gut unconscious level to be held in the portrait, whether it's a 1-hour study in the classroom from life, or it's a long-term portrait sitting with the model, or if I'm illustrating and working from photo reference that I took myself or being handed perhaps by an art director or a client. Those kinds of, I'm using the term architecture, your eye to a focal area can give tremendous strength and stability to a portrait study. You guys didn't know that we were underhandedly trying to reach into your gut and get you interested in our portrait work. Remember a moment ago I said, well, I don't want your eye to be drawn down into the corner for no good reason. Well, what do? We look at her eye first, and then psychologically we follow her gaze. If I have my portrait hanging in a gallery and someone else's work is, say, hanging on the rung below mine, I do not want to sell their work for them. I want to hold you in this image, not send you shooting out the bottom and somewhere else. And so the exaggerated strength of these radiating lines are meant to combat that, to bring you right back up to the eye. These are not mindless strokes. There is a method to the madness.